That's enough out of you. A weekly podcast where you'll hear the truth, or at least a closer version of the truth than most of the bullshit that's out there. Here are your hosts, Bill Rader and Sean Kane.
Welcome to That's Enough Out of You. This is a weekly podcast where we talk about all kinds of stuff. We talk about history, we talk about sports, we talk about sports history, we talk about current events and pop culture, all kinds of stuff.
Talk about whatever we want because it's our show.
It's our show. I'm your host, Bill Rader.
And I'm Sean Kane.
All right, and we are going to get into this month. So as we record these, we're actually recording them for the month of November, which, as many of you, probably most of you that listening to this show know, that November 1963 was the month that JFK was assassinated. So we're doing a whole series on JFK. Our initial episode was focused on the JFK presidency. The series that we do this month is on the assassination. And so this is another episode in that series. And Sean, so we'll get to the topic in a minute, but what topic are we going to focus on for this episode?
We're going to talk about conspiracies in general, and then we're going to talk about Oswald's 201 file, Bill. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the documents, this is not a theory, but what the documents say.
Yeah.
And what the documents tell us, because we know so much now that we didn't know, 30, 40 years ago with the release of the new information.
Well, this is a topic where I admittedly don't have a ton of information. So I'm really gonna, when we get into the topic, Sean, I'm really just gonna kind of hand it over to you and let you talk through it, and then maybe follow up with some questions at the end. But
okay, because we're going to be talking about when we get into the CIA, when we get into 201 files and stuff, it gets really complex. So yeah, I'll try to explain it the best we can.
All right, sounds good. Now, our first couple of episodes have been released. So as we record this, we are about 2 or so weeks into the new podcast. We've been recording like crazy. We got a lot of episodes that are coming out, but our first episode, the JFK episode, is doing pretty well. We're getting a lot of downloads, getting a lot of good feedback, a lot of good reviews. We actually got a question. We got a listener question, Sean. I got
outstanding
for you. So this question comes from our listener, Dr. Irene. And Dr. Irene says, Sean mentioned that Joe Kennedy knew that Jack's decision about Algeria was going to prove right. So this is something you mentioned in that first episode.
Yes.
That, now what she says is Joe Kennedy was a mobster and a crooked politician. Sean, I wonder if you know how Joe Kennedy knew how things with Algeria were going to materialize. And then she kind of goes on to say she grew up in Boston, not too far from the Kennedys. And she said she heard a lot of stories growing up about Joe Kennedy. There was a lot of mystique about him.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for the question. As far as Joe Kennedy and the mob stuff, a lot of that you got to be careful what you hear from the street. You know what I mean? Like we talked about this before. Like Joe Kennedy was vetted when he was FDR's ambassador to England, and none of that mob stuff came out. It didn't come out until JFK was running for president. And it came out, a lot of it came out from Richard Nixon's crew there. So as far as that goes, I mean, I don't really want to get into that right now. But as far as the Algeria thing, I think he understood what JFK understood, that colonialism doesn't work. And he understood that the French have to get out of Algeria, that the will of the people was so strong that they wanted freedom. And he understood that. And again, I think it goes to their Irish roots. They understand, what Great Britain controlled Ireland and what colonialism did in Ireland and now, Northern Ireland. So I think that's why he understood that. But at the time, JFK was really ridiculed for that speech. Everybody was against him, even people in his own party. Nobody, wanted to side against the French because they were a key ally. So I think that Joe just understood about colonialism, that colonialism doesn't work, and that, JFK was right into speaking out against it.
So you don't think there was anything nefarious going on? I mean, I think that maybe what the question is implying is that Joe Kennedy might have had something to do with it, or, knew in advance that something was going to happen, but you don't think that was the case?
No, I don't think there was anything nefarious about that. I mean, I think, JFK just went to his father for advice, and, he felt that, he really made a mistake. JFK really, because everybody, the media had turned on him, his own party has turned on him. And he's thinking, geez, did I really, should I have not done this? Did this just ruin my career? And, Joe just told him, no, I think, he actually, the words he said, I think he said, you don't realize how lucky you are, because people are going to see down the road that you were right. And that's what they did.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think, with regard to Joe Kennedy, we could probably, we should do an episode on Joe Kennedy. I think there is a lot of probably misinformation out there about him.
Well, the one thing is, Bill, and I mentioned this before, like when you throw around that word bootlegger and mobster and stuff like that, like Bugs Moran was a bootlegger, Al Capone was a bootlegger, Dean O'Banion was a bootlegger, Johnny Torrio was a bootlegger. I mean, these guys were ruthless killers. I mean, to put Joe Kennedy in that light because people on the street are saying that, that's not what the documents are saying.
Right.
Now, if you want to look at Joe Kennedy's ties to say the Rockefellers, okay, I understand that.
Well, Joe Kennedy was ruthless in the sense that he's a ruthless businessman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But there's a difference again, when you're talking about a ruthless businessman and you're talking about bootleggers and gangsters.
Right.
A gangster is a gangster. You know what I mean? And there's a big difference when you're talking about guys like Moran. I mean, Moran was as vicious as it gets.
Yeah. Yep. All right, good. Well, thank you, Dr. Irene, for the question. Really good question. Keep them coming. We love the questions. We love the feedback. We're getting, like I said, we're getting a lot of reviews and 5-star ratings, a lot of views on our YouTube page. We want to keep those coming. We have all of our episodes are up on the YouTube page. It's just search for That's Enough Out of You on YouTube and you'll get to our page. Please subscribe and please like all the videos. And then on our podcast, we also want you to subscribe. We want you to know when our new shows are out there and coming out, and we want to know what you're thinking. We want to know that you like us or whatever, any opinion you have about the show, any question you have, feel free, give us an email at that's enough out of you show@gmail.com.
And thanks again, Dr. Irene, for the question. Very
good question too. Yeah, great question. All right, Sean, I am essentially going to hand the show over to you and just let you talk.
Okay, Bill. Well, let's talk about conspiracies. So it's like everything else in this country, Bill. It seems like we have to go to the extreme of everything we talk about. And it drives me crazy. Like there's two thoughts on conspiracies. There's people that say everything is a conspiracy, which is utterly ridiculous. You have to look at every situation. And this is where, you get in trouble where, you just seen what happened when a guy just got sued for $900 million because he made comments that defamed victims in a tragedy. Like sometimes it's not a deep state conspiracy. It's a bad person doing a bad thing. And he's, one guy shoots a bunch of kids. It's awful. It's a tragedy, but it's not a conspiracy. So you have to take every situation in the context. And then there's the other side, Bill, which seems to be the mainstream media and the government that says there's no conspiracies. Nothing is a conspiracy. All the assassinations of the 60s were the work of lone gunmen. And it's just ridiculous, Bill. Because think about this. If there's no conspiracies, then all the mobsters that are sitting in jail convicted on the RICO law must be innocent, because the RICO law by definition is a conspiracy law, correct?
Right. Yep.
I mean, the bosses aren't the ones doing the crimes. They're directing all the traffic. So by association, they get them on the RICO law. So conspiracies do exist, Bill. And, you have to look at every situation. and I laugh when I hear the word conspiracy theorist, because that word has taken on such a negative connotation. I mean, let me ask you, Bill, how many times have you heard the phrase when somebody says, well, I'm not really conspiracy theorist, but, and they try to explain something
Right.
because they don't want to be considered a conspiracy theorist. And that word goes back to our good friend, old Alan Dulles, because when the Warren Commission came out, Dulles got together with the best and the brightest at the agency, and he wanted to come up with a term that would discredit all the people that went against the findings of the Warren Commission. So they used the word conspiracy theorist, and then they fed it to their assets in the media under Operation Mockingbird. And it worked effectively to this day, honestly, because you think about it, everybody now is lumped into that. If you go against the grain on anything, you're considered a conspiracy theorist, and I take you back to a story, Bill. When I was in college, I went to a Catholic college, and there was two professors. One was a priest, and we used to talk to them after class a lot. And both of them were Kennedy lovers. They loved everything Kennedy. But when it came to an assassination, the priest wouldn't even talk about it. Okay, it was so, it was like it happened yesterday to him. He just didn't even want to talk about it. But the other professor would toe the line. He would say, Oswald did it. That's it. It was a tragedy. It was a lone gunman. Nothing we could do about it. And one day I was just hitting him with all kind of evidence, to prove Oswald didn't do it. And finally he snapped at me. He said, look at Sean. He said, I know you're right. But he said, I'm not going to be ridiculed by my colleagues and called some crazy conspiracy theorist, searching for aliens. And I take to that comment, I'm like, what are you saying? You're saying that, you don't want to tell the truth because you're afraid that people are going to ridicule you? And again, it goes back to that term, Alan Dulles, the evil genius, conspiracy theorist, anybody who goes against the grain, even if the evidence shows that Oswald didn't do it, you're a crazy conspiracy theorist. You know what I'm saying?
And also at that time, there wasn't a whole lot of mistrust in
No.
the government. And this was pre-Vietnam. This was,
Sure.
Pre-Watergate. So there really wasn't.
And Bill, there's people that actually, researched when the trust in government actually it actually started, the mistrust really started in 1964 when the Warren Commission came out. That's where, people started to think the government wasn't telling the truth about things. And actually, if you look at that word conspiracy theorist, people actually researched that too. It wasn't used in the media hardly at all before the Warren Commission. And it definitely wasn't used in a negative connotation. But then after the Warren Commission came out, it was used quite a bit. And again, that goes to the evil genius of Alan Dulles. Okay, so what we're going to talk about tonight is the 201 file is an intelligence file. It's a personality file that the CIA keeps on assets or suspects or anybody that they're, could be a spy that they're spying on or whatever. But it's basically an intelligence file. It's a personality file, I mean. So what we're going to talk about tonight is how the CIA controlled Lee Harvey Oswald's files from 1959 up until the time of the assassination. And that's something the CIA can't explain, Bill, because we're told this guy's a lone gunman. He acted alone. He had no ties to nothing. What were they doing controlling his files? Okay. And then when you really take a look, and in the next episode, we'll really take a look at Oswald. And when you start to see his associations, you start to see, is Oswald a true communist, or is he an agent provocateur, a double agent working as an intelligence asset for the government? And then when we outlived his usefulness, he was set up and used to take the fall in this assassination. So let's start when he defected to the Soviet Union. So if you look at when somebody defects to the Soviet Union, Bill, the way it should have happened with his files, it's at the Office of Mail Logistics at the CIA, all the files come through. When somebody defects like that to say Russia, the files should have went to the SR division, okay, which is a Soviet Russian division, which, think about it, makes sense because they're the ones that got boots on the ground. They could keep an eye on things. That's where you want the file going. But what we found out from a lady by the name of Betsy Wolf, who did the work at the House Select Committee on Assassinations, is that Oswald's file was rigged. It was rigged from the time that it first came into the Office of Mail Logistics in 1959, and it was sent to the Office of Security, okay? And it was controlled by James Angleton, who was Allen Dulles' right-hand man and the chief of counterintelligence for over 25 years at the CIA. Now, Bill, the Office of Security is the last place that Oswald's files should have been going to. I mean, the Office of Security, every bad thing you heard about the CIA, whether it's true or not, comes out of the Office of Security. I mean, the MK Ultra program came out of there. The ZR rifle assassination program came out of there. I mean, there's no explanation for Oswald's file going to the Office of Security, okay, and being controlled by James Angleton. James Angleton also running counterintelligence. He was also running something called the SIG unit, which is the Special Investigative Group. Okay, and what they were, Bill, is they were mole hunters. So they're basically spies looking for other spies. Now, when you talk about Angleton, Bill, he's a very, very powerful individual, very powerful, and he gets his power from Allen Dulles. Okay, so let's start at the defection of Oswald. So Oswald is in the Marines, and did anyone ever ask the question, like, what is a communist doing in the United States Marines during the Cold War? But here he is. Here's this communist. He defects to the Soviet Union. He goes over there, meets a Russian girl, comes back. Okay, and the way the whole defection went down, Bill, is he was in the military. He got out of the military because he said something happened to his mother. And it was actually, like, if you could believe this, Bill, a box of candy or something fell off a shelf and hit her in the nose, and she put a Band-Aid on it, and he gets released for that. And then a couple of days later, he's on a boat to Finland, and then he's off to the Soviet Union. Okay, now I'm going to show later when we talk about Oswald that he was really part of the false defector program that the CIA and Navy intelligence were running, where they're putting people into the Soviet Union as false defectors to try to get information on the Soviets. But for now, when you look at Oswald's files, it's showing him defecting to the Soviet Union. So it's tying him to Russia. Then he comes back. Like I said, he meets a girl, Marina, marries her, brings her over. And he's in Dallas, okay? And his best friend in Dallas is a guy by the name of George de Mohrenschildt, who we talked about on the earlier episode on JFK, that he had ties to Allen Dulles. And we'll talk about that when we talk more about Oswald. But he's down in Dallas, and he's recruiting kids on campuses like SMU and stuff for communism, okay? Then, Bill, he goes to New Orleans. Okay, now all this is in his file. All this is in his file. Then he goes to New Orleans, and he sets up the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Okay, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is a pro-Castro, pro-communist committee. Now, why in the world would anybody set it up in New Orleans? Okay, New Orleans and Miami are probably the two places in the United States that hate Castro the most. And the Fair Play for Cuba Committee had no members in New Orleans except Oswald. Okay, they're based out of New York, and the New York chapter didn't want him to set this up. But the interesting thing, Bill, is he sets it up right in the heart of the intelligence community in New Orleans, right where the David Adlai Phillips, who's an important CIA figure we're going to talk a lot about, is running the Fair Play, the anti-Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He's trying to discredit the whole thing, and Oswald is running that right there where they're running this, the anti-Fair Play for Cuba Committee. You understand what I'm saying? So this is where it comes into, is Oswald really a communist, or is he an agent provocateur? But again, his files right now, we're just looking at what his files are showing. They're showing him with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. So they're tying him to Cuba. He's already tied to Russia. Okay. So now we get to September, before the assassination, and Oswald supposedly takes this trip to Mexico City. Now, the Mexico City trip, Bill, is the Rosetta Stone of the Kennedy assassination. It's the key to everything. Yeah. Okay. Now, Oswald, supposedly what he was doing there is he went to the Cuban consulate. And what he's trying to do, Bill, is he's trying to get an in-transit visa into Cuba. Okay. And they told him, they said, look, you have to go to the State Department. Okay. So what he actually did is he went to before he went to the Cuban consulate, he went to the Russian consulate. Okay. And he talks to a guy, an attaché at the consulate by the name of Valery Kostakov. Now, remember that name, Bill. It's a key name, Kostakov.
Okay.
Okay. And he's talking to him and he tells him, listen, you have to go to the State Department. And he says, you have to go through the State Department. So supposedly Oswald makes this big scene, okay, this huge scene, and threatens to bring a gun in and everything else and all this stuff. And then he leaves nothing happens to him. He leaves the Russian consulate. He goes to the Cuban consulate, okay, and he does the same thing. He's trying to get in transit visa, and they tell him, you got to go through your State Department. So then later on, there's a phone call, okay, to the Cuban consulate, and the person on the phone is saying, you know, I just talked to Comrade Colston. He keeps saying Comrade Colston, and they said there's no Comrade Colston here, and it's almost like he's trying to get the person to say Kostakov, and then the guy says, you mean Kostakov? And the person on the phone says, yes, I talked to Comrade Kostakov. Okay, now by doing that, now all of a sudden you got the Russian consulate, the Cuban consulate, and Oswald tied, and you got this guy Kostakov, who's the attaché, tied. Now here's the interesting thing, Bill. David Alley Phillips of the CIA is working at the time in the Mexico City office, and he says absolutely that Oswald was there, okay? But here's the problem, Bill. There's no photograph of Oswald ever being there. And the CIA had what they called pulse cameras, Bill. Okay, everybody coming into those, both consulates, the Russian and the Cuban in Mexico City, were photographed because that was a hotbed of intelligence activity.
Right.
So the first picture they put out, they said, here's this picture of Oswald, and he looks like a Russian bear. He's like 6'6", 260. There's no way that guy's Oswald. I mean,
Right.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Then there was another guy, Bill, okay, who's a blonde Oswald, short. You can tell by the pictures it's not Oswald, but interesting is it matches the description of people that described the Oswald that came into the consulate, okay? And David Alley Phillips said, oh, you know, that wasn't Oswald either. And there was all kind of confusion. But anyway, this is getting confusing. In his files, we have everything tying Oswald to Cuba and Russia up to this point, okay? So if you look at his files, the spotlight is put on Oswald completely, okay? And now we're 6 weeks out of the assassination, 6 weeks before the assassination. And what happens is James Angleton at the CIA, who's controlling Oswald's files, he's completely controlling Oswald's files. He starts manipulating the files, and he really starts gutting it. And he's putting everything into a SIG operational file. So he's basically gutting his 201 file. And this is important, Bill, because say you're a Secret Service agent, right? Because remember, Oswald's about to be, all the lights and whistles are about to go off on Oswald because he's on the parade route. Okay, he's going to be on the parade route where the president is working in the Texas School Book Depository building.
Right.
Okay, so by manipulating his files and gutting them, okay, you lower Oswald's threat profile. Okay, and the thing is, while this is happening at the CIA, it's also happening at the FBI because they had a flash on Oswald's files from the domestic division of the FBI. And think of it like a blinking red light, Bill. And 6 weeks before, that flash is taken off, which takes Oswald off the watch list, okay? So now everything is set for Oswald to be put in place. So think about this, Bill. Here's how I'm going to explain this. They put the spotlight on Oswald. He's a communist. He's tied to Russia, to Cuba. And then 6 weeks before the assassination, they dim the spotlight, okay? Lowering his threat profile. But before they do, they infected with this virus. And think of this virus is the Mexico City trip and this guy Kostakov that he met. Now, that virus is not going to be activated until the assassination goes through. You understand what I'm saying?
No. Well, you mean an actual virus or?
No, I'm talking about, not an actual virus, Bill. No, let me explain what happens. So here's what happens. So you understand how his files are working up to this point. Like if you say you were a Secret Service agent, Bill, and you're looking at Oswald's file,
yeah,
and you want to look at anybody who's on the parade route, okay? And you open up Oswald's file. Now, if you opened it up before the 6 weeks, you would have found a lot of stuff tying him to Russia and Cuba right in the middle of the Cold War. That would have been like if after 9/11, the president was coming and somebody, on the parade route was tied to a extreme Muslim group, right? What would have happened, Bill? They would have took that person off. They would have changed the parade route, correct?
Of course.
Of course.
Well, I mean, there wasn't a parade route for 9/11, but I understand what you mean.
No, but I'm saying, like, say after 9/11, if the president happened to come visit, even say 5 years after.
Right. Oh, I got you.
You know what I'm saying? And the president.
Sean, let me, and
Go ahead.
I apologize for interrupting because maybe I'm confused. I don't know if the listener's confused. Are you saying that Oswald was a CIA operative, or that he was just on their radar and they had a file on him because they were watching him?
What I'm saying, Bill, is he is a CIA asset. I don't know if he's a full-blown agent, but he's definitely an asset, because I'm going to talk more about that in the next episode when we talk about Oswald. But when he goes to Russia, he's part of the false defector program. So he's part of what the CIA is trying to do, putting spies into Russia. When he goes to Dallas, he's part of, he's being handled by George de Mohrenschildt, who has ties to the CIA. Then he's passed off to Ruth and Michael Payne, who I'm going to talk about later, who's going to take over as his handlers. They're tied to the CIA, and specifically Allen Dulles. Okay, then he goes to New Orleans, where he's supposedly running this Fair Play for Cuba, pro-Castro group, but he's running it right out of a building where they're running the CIA is running the anti-Fair Play for Cuba committee. Okay,
same building, right?
Same building, Bill, and we'll talk about that when we get into Oswald and the Garrison investigation. But that was being run by, again, a name that comes up a lot, David Atlee Phillips, who was working with Guy Bannister in New Orleans. Okay, but the thing is, Bill, his files, Bill, okay, everything in his file is showing ties to Cuba and Russia. Okay, but then 6 weeks before, everything is gutted from the file. The Mexico City trip, the ties to Castro, the Fair Play for Cuba, everything is gutted. So his threat profile is lowered. Okay, do you understand that part?
Yes, absolutely understand that. Yeah.
So let me tell you what happens next. So the assassination goes through, okay? And then here comes James Angleton at the CIA. And now at the highest levels in national security, the highest levels, Bill, there's an Operation Tumbleweed that is declassified, only at the highest levels. Operation Tumbleweed was an investigation into, it started as an FBI investigation into the Russian consulate in, what happened was they got onto this guy, Valery Kostakov, who I mentioned that Oswald supposedly met with. Now, Operation Tumbleweed proves that Valery Kostakov was not just an attaché at the consulate. He was head of something called Department 13, which was the KGB's assassination and sabotage unit in the Western Hemisphere. So now do you understand what I said by a virus? Because think about it, Bill. Anybody who was dealing with Oswald, and Oswald had ties to a lot of different agencies. He was working as an asset, as an informant and different things. Anybody tied to Oswald now is infected with this virus. Okay, it's not a real virus, but it's going to force everybody to go in the cover your own ass mode. You understand? So people that aren't involved in the assassination are now going to be forced, for a couple of different reasons, to cover it up, to cover up their involvement with Oswald. Nobody wants ties to this guy now because you're radioactive, Bill. You understand what I'm saying? And also now you have the threat of World War III, because if Castro and Khrushchev were behind this, okay, using Oswald through Valery Kostakov, who's a KGB assassination chief. I mean, think about what's going on at the high levels, okay? So now here's what happens, Bill. So there's a meeting between Lyndon Johnson, who's now sworn in as president, Katzenbach, who's the acting attorney general, filling in for the grieving Bobby Kennedy, and J. Edgar Hoover, okay? And they're telling them all this information that's coming from Angleton and Phillips at the CIA, okay? And Johnson is a nervous wreck. Now, Johnson has no problem going into Vietnam, because remember, we talked about the military's, it's just, they're pushing Vietnam on them. But also they're pushing the Soviet Union and Castro if they were behind this, we gotta act. And Johnson is so scared of World War III. He says to Katzenbach, he says, we need to take this out of the realm of a communist conspiracy. Okay, that's his exact words to Katzenbach. Okay, now J. Edgar Hoover says, well, if that's the case, then we need to convince the public that Lee Harvey Oswald is the lone assassin. Now that's right in the documents. Now he's not saying Oswald is the lone assassin, because Hoover knows the evidence against him is not good. Okay, but he's saying we need to convince the public so there's no war, because we don't want a nuclear war. Okay,
Right.
but Bill, it gets worse, because then there's a later conversation between Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. Okay, and nobody else is in on this conversation. And Hoover says, Mr. President, we got another problem. He says, my FBI agents who are interrogating Oswald in Dallas also heard the tapes, okay, of the Oswald that was in Mexico City meeting with Kostakov. And guess what, Bill? The voice recognition does not match. It was not the same guy. It was not Oswald. He was impersonated in Mexico City. So now Hoover and Johnson are, you got to realize, like, what, I know a lot of people want to say Lyndon Johnson was behind the assassination, this and that. There's no evidence of that, but there is evidence that Johnson covered it up after the fact because he was nervous of World War III.
Right.
And now think about this, Bill. Johnson has a choice, because at this point, him and Hoover realize that if Oswald's impersonated, okay, who's trying to pin this on the Russians and the Cubans? It's the CIA. They're getting evidence from Phillips. They're getting evidence from Angleton. And right within an hour of the assassination, Bill, assets related to David Atlee Phillips were out on the street talking to the media, talking to anybody that would listen, trying to tie Oswald to Castro. And they were saying that Castro was behind this. Castro pulled this off. So you have Phillips out there, you know, waving the flag to start a war with the Soviets and with the Cubans. Okay. So at this point, Lyndon Johnson has to be going, his mind's got to be going all over the place. He's thinking he's got to know if the CIA is pushing this angle, they're probably behind these shenanigans. But him and Hoover don't want to take on guys like Dulles and Angleton and Phillips. They want no part of taking those people on. So what do? They have another choice. Do they go with the Soviet angle and the Cuban angle and start a war? No, they're afraid of that. So they go with the lone gunman angle. And this is where all the stuff started coming in. And then this is where the Warren Commission started to be formed.
So let me just, can I just ask you something real quick?
Go ahead.
All of this back and forth between Johnson and Hoover.
Right.
Is this happening before Oswald gets killed, or is it after?
I believe, well, it's all happening like that whole weekend, Bill. This is happening. So I'm thinking,
because JFK was killed on
it's
what was it, a Thursday
before,
or
Bill.
Friday?
Well, JFK was killed on a Friday.
Friday.
So Ruby was killed on a Sunday. So
Oswald.
remember I talked about the Monday.
Oswald was killed on.
Or I'm sorry, Ruby killed Oswald on Sunday.
Sunday, yes.
And then Monday was when Johnson basically reverses Vietnam and everything. So I figured this is that Sunday, Bill. Everything has happened. This is before Ruby shoots Oswald, though. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
But the thing is, Bill, the important thing is that Hoover and Johnson know that the voice doesn't match, that Oswald, his agents are telling him, listen, it's not the same guy. That's not the guy in the recording that we have in the jail that we're interviewing, that we're interrogating. So at this point, they know that the CIA has to be involved in these shenanigans, you know, but they don't do nothing, Bill. They don't go to Katzenbach and tell them about that. They don't go to Bobby Kennedy and tell them about that. They don't go to John McCone, who's now put in as the head of the CIA that took over for Allen Dulles when Kennedy fired Dulles. And at this point, Bill, where is good old Allen Dulles? Well, we know from his own day calendar that was in Princeton University that since then has disappeared, but people already seen it and it's been, you know, put out on the internet. But his day calendar said that the whole weekend of the assassination, he was at the farm. Now, the farm is the CIA's secret base where they train operatives and they run black operations out of. Let me ask you this, Bill. What in the world was Alan Dulles doing at the farm the weekend of the assassination? I mean, he's not fishing. I mean,
Right.
this isn't a place where retired directors go for a camping trip. And not even retired, Bill. He was fired by Kennedy. So
Right.
how does he even have access to this base? But like I said on the first episode about Kennedy, when Alan Dulles was fired, he didn't lose his power. He just lost the title. Okay. And then what happens next, Bill, is that Johnson is getting phone calls to set up the Warren Commission, and people, a lot of powerful people connected to the Rockefellers are pushing Alan Dulles to get put on this commission. Now, to put Alan Dulles on the Warren Commission, Bill, is like putting OJ in charge of investigation into the death of his ex-wife. I mean,
Right.
how do you put a
Ridiculous.
guy? Well, Bill, how do you put a guy in charge of a truth commission that's greatest asset is keeping secrets? I mean, that's what this guy does. I mean, he even told he said one time in an interview, he said that CIA agents are obligated to lie when asked about any operations. So how could you trust anything this man says? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense.
No.
But again, nothing about this really makes sense.
Well, let me ask you this, Bill. Now, do you see what I'm saying? What happened? Like what the documents prove? This isn't a theory. This is what the documents prove. The CIA put the spotlight on Oswald. He's connected to the Russians. He's connected to the Cubans. And then 6 weeks before the assassination, they lower that spotlight. They dim it. And they lower his threat profile, taking him off watch list, taking him off because everything is going to be exposed because he is going to be on the parade route. Anybody doing background checks is going to see, here's this guy linked to the Cubans, linked to the Russians during the middle of the Cold War, Bill. Remember, there was almost a nuclear war a year earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you have this Mexico City trip, which I'm calling a virus. Okay. And then that virus is activated because think of a guy, like you say you're a guy, Win Scott, who ran the Mexico City office of the CIA. Win Scott, there's no evidence that he had anything to do with these shenanigans, but he's running the Mexico City office. So he's running Oswald as an intelligence asset against the Russians and the Cubans. Okay. And Phillips, he admitted later that Phillips lied to him and Phillips was doing all these things behind his back. But think about him the day of the assassination, when it comes out that Oswald is arrested for the president's murder. He's got to be thinking, oh my God, did the Soviets and the communists, the Cubans, did they flip one of our own assets and use him to kill the commander in chief? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So, I mean, do you have any questions?
Well, I mean,
there's a lot of information here.
There's a lot of information. And I think, kind of sorting through all that information and trying to figure out what does all of this mean, in terms of why was Oswald there? Did he, I mean, I know in recent years, the sort of, thinking about this is that not only did Oswald not kill the president, he may not have even known what was happening until after it happened.
And we'll get into that in the next episode, But think about this, Bill. When everybody wants to say, well, I got a theory, I got this. I mean, let's just look at what the documents prove, okay? If you're looking at this, in order the conspirators have to know who Coast to Cove is, right? Like, in order to pull this off, you have to know that Coast to Cove is not an attaché. He's the head of Department 13, the assassination unit. Now, the fellas over the Bada Bing Club in Jersey, they don't know who Coast to Cove is. The guys down in Mississippi burning crosses, they don't know who Coast to Cove is. Right. Yes, the Mafia and the KKK hated Kennedy, but they don't know who Coast to Cove is, Bill. Yeah. He's only known at the highest levels, this Operation Tumbleweed. And then if you look at, who's controlling Oswald's files, it's not the Mafia, it's not the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, since 1959, Angleton rigged Oswald's files, and he's in control of everything on Lee Harvey Oswald up until the assassination. And he manipulates those files 6 weeks before. And then, Bill, ask yourself this: who was the one who destroyed or manipulated every single investigation into Kennedy's death? It wasn't the Mafia. It wasn't the Ku Klux Klan. It wasn't Oswald's parents. I mean, the Warren Commission's being manipulated by Alan Dulles. Okay, you have the Jim Garrison investigation in New Orleans was absolutely destroyed by CIA director at the time, Richard Helms, who set up the Get Garrison group, and absolutely, he was bugging Garrison's office. He destroyed Garrison in the media.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the House Select Committee on Assassinations bill in the 70s that was also destroyed by the CIA, manipulated by a CIA agent by the name of George Joanides, who happened to be the same agent that was working for David Atlee Phillips in New Orleans, out of that office that Guy Bannister was running.
Yeah.
He was running those Cubans, Bill.
Yeah.
Okay. And it just goes, you have to ask yourself, where does all the evidence lead? It doesn't lead to the Bada Bing Club, Joe or Bill. You understand what I'm saying?
Right.
You can't just because this group hated Kennedy or that group hated. A lot of people had motive to kill Kennedy. Like you said last time, he was making a lot of powerful enemies, a lot. But you have to go by what the documentation proves. Who is in position to pull this off? And then the next thing you know is Alan Dulles is on the Warren Commission. And do you want to finish up, Bill, last segment here and just talk about the Warren Commission a little bit?
Yeah, I think we could get into that a little bit. We'll probably do more in another episode, but yeah, let's
finish with that because Bill, like the Warren Commission. So Alan Dulles is there, and of course Rockefeller and his guys are promoting Dulles to get on the commission. But Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the land, did not want to take this job. He did not want to do this. And we now know that Lyndon Johnson scared him to death. Okay. Earl Warren left the meeting in tears, Bill, because Johnson told him, look, he says, you need to do what's best for this country, because he told him about Kostakov and Oswald meeting with Kostakov, and that it's likely that the Russians and the Cubans are behind that. Now think about that, Bill. He knows the Kostakov stuff is bullshit. He knows that because he knows that Oswald is impersonated, but he's telling Earl Warren, who loved Kennedy. He was the only guy in the commission that liked Kennedy. The rest were enemies of Kennedy. And he's telling them, if you don't do this, 20 million Americans could be killed in a nuclear war.
Yeah.
You're going to have that on your conscience. So Earl Warren takes the job as head of the Warren Commission. Go ahead, Bill.
No, you probably are getting to this. I want to, you're saying Warren was really the only friend of Kennedy on this commission.
Absolutely.
Who was on the commission?
Well, let's go over every member. You have
All right.
Alan Dulles, who Kennedy fired.
Right.
Okay. You have John McCloy, who was a Rockefeller banker. I mean, they might as well put David Rockefeller on there if you're going to put John McCloy. John McCloy was involved in Japanese internment. I mean, we could go on about John McCloy. He hated Kennedy. Okay. Then you had Gerald Ford, who would later be president, who was like a stooge of J. Edgar Hoover at the time, but he hated Kennedy. Okay. Then you had the Southern Wing. Okay. Which would have been Richard Russell, who was LBJ's mentor, Sherman Cooper, and you had Hale Boggs. Okay. Hale Boggs would actually be involved in the Garrison investigation. He was giving Garrison information. And of course, Hale Boggs disappeared in a plane crash in Alaska, but I'm sure that wasn't, no funny business there. But anyway, the Southern Wing, Bill, hated Kennedy because of civil rights. Okay. But here's the interesting thing. The Southern Wing, which I just mentioned, those three guys, none of them believed in the Warren Commission theory that's put out there that Oswald was the lone assassin, Bill. In fact, Richard Russell went to Hoover, and there's a conversation, it's a phone conversation between the two of them. And he's saying to Johnson, Oswald could not have done this alone. He's telling him that. And he said, I don't believe it. I don't believe that a guy, the first shot that he takes, when he's the only shot that he's able to set, he misses by a mile and hits a guy on the other side of the street. Okay. So here's what happens, Bill. They set up a meeting with Richard Russell and the other two with Alan Dulles, and Alan Dulles was taken down. He had a stenographer there. I think it was his niece or something. And they're taking notes, and Richard Russell was saying his grievances, that he didn't believe that Oswald acted alone. And Cooper and Boggs were backing him up, okay, saying that we didn't believe that either. Now, wasn't found out till years later that that meeting never made it into the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission. So Russell found out about that. He was hopping mad because he got snookered by old Alan Dulles. That Dulles' niece was probably over there doing her homework. She wasn't taking notes. None of that was ever going to get into the files, you know, and he wouldn't be the first to be snookered by Alan Dulles, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. But Russell never believed it. But again, it never made it into Warren report.
It seems like that would be a pretty important thing.
Well, you think it, well, especially when the media drives it down your throat, Bill. Every investigation into Kennedy's death, all of them said there was some kind of conspiracy, except for the Warren Commission, who said it was the lone gunman, right? But
the magic
now
bullet.
you're finding out that 3 of these members did not believe it. They didn't believe it.
Yeah.
And if you listen,
and they were enemies. They were enemies.
They hated Kennedy. Listen, Richard Russell was a racist. He was anti-civil rights. I mean, but again, you have to give him some credit here because he was asked to do a job by the president. And again, he didn't want to do this job either. Johnson snookered him, and he used the same line he used, saying that, oh, there's going to be 20 million dead Americans. There's going to be a nuclear war. You have to get on this commission. But Richard Russell, to his credit, did his job. And he didn't believe that there was, you know, that this was the act of one man. But again, it never made it into the 26 volumes because Alan Dulles was there to deflect, to control, and to manipulate. And again, Bill, you know, Earl Warren has a job at that point. He's the Chief Justice of the land. Alan Dulles was fired by Kennedy. He really doesn't have a job except being, you know, head of this invisible government, really. I mean, he doesn't, you know, so he's the most active member of the commission. And that's proven when by people that went through the minutes of all the meetings. Alan Dulles was the most active member of the committee.
So here's the question that has to be asked, John.
Mm-hmm.
These 3 members of the Warren Commission that didn't believe the lone gunman theory, that didn't believe the magic bullet.
Right.
Why didn't they speak up?
That's a great question, Bill. I mean, I can't answer that. I don't know. Why didn't they? That's a great question. I mean, Richard Russell finds out, like, he was hopping mad about it, but why didn't he say anything before that? Because he didn't find out till years later that none of that made it into the volumes. But in the media is all over this. Before the Warren Commission report even came out, we know that a lot of these networks like CBS was manipulated by John McCloy, and you know, it was put out there that Oswald is the guy. That's it. So why didn't Russell speak up then? I don't know. I can't answer that. I mean, did he not want to ruin his career? Did he not want to take on Alan Dulles? Did he not want to take on Lyndon Johnson? I don't know, Bill. Why didn't he speak up? And Hale Boggs, why did Hale Boggs wait until the Garrison investigation and start, instead of going to the press, he was going to Garrison with information on the secret level. You know what I'm saying? So why didn't these guys speak up? I don't know, Bill. That's a great question. They didn't have any backbone to speak up.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, that's why to this day, there's still so much mystery and doubt about, you know, and there's really, I mean, with all the documents we have, with everything you're talking about, it's pretty clear what happened. It's just, you know, you would think at some point somebody would say, all right, I'm going to meet with, you know, a news agency, whether it's as an anonymous source, you know, Deep Throat, or somebody, you know, who just wants to set the record straight and just come out and say, listen, this may cost me my career, may cost me my life, but I need the world to know what really happened, or at least that it didn't happen the way that they're telling you it happened.
Right. Well, the thing is, Bill, a lot of careers were made by keeping your mouth shut and saying that Oswald was the lone gunman. Yeah. And the media, the entire media was on this, that Oswald was the lone gunman, and that was it. And that was it. And like Alan Dulles said, Americans don't read. So what's in those 26 volumes doesn't matter because nobody's going to read it. Well, some of us actually did. And when you read it, doesn't point the finger towards Lee Harvey Oswald. you know. And again, I would like somebody to explain to me who's controlling these files. The CIA is controlling. James Angleton is in position to know everything about Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, he's controlling Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
And I think we also need to make clear to our listener that we're not saying Lee Harvey Oswald is innocent, but he's innocent of this. He's innocent of killing the president.
Well,
right.
Well, yeah, Bill. I mean, you got to go with the evidence, and we'll go over the evidence. In the next episode, we talk about Oswald, because it's pretty ridiculous how bad the evidence is against him, and how the Warren Commission again covered so much up, and again, Alan Dulles is there, and John McCloy is there too. Let's make that clear too. John McCloy is deflecting a lot of this too, because again, he's close to David Rockefeller. He's close to Alan Dulles. So again, how do you justify putting John McCloy and Alan Dulles on this committee? I mean, unless you want a secret to be kept. That's the only explanation, to have these two guys on a truth commission, Bill. Otherwise, it makes no sense.
Makes no sense.
So I don't know, but I got a little fired up there. I might have to take a jog around the block. But I hope the stuff was clear, because it gets a little complex when you're talking about, when you talk about Oswald and you talk about these intelligence things, like it's like, everything that appears to be something is actually something else when you're dealing with these complex intelligence operations. And it does get confusing again, but just keep with the base thought of who's controlling Oswald's files. I mean, here's this lone gunman who really the government says was a loser and wanted attention and got it by killing a president, but yet the CIA knew about him since 5-6 years before the assassination.
Right.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly that was all bullshit. It was, there was no, it was a story to put the American public at ease, to say to them, hey, this was not, this was not Russia, that we're not going to war.
And Hoover basically says that, Bill. That's exactly what he says. We need to convince the public.
Yeah.
He's not saying that Oswald is the guy. He's saying we just need to convince the public.
Right. Because
Johnson is so scared of a nuclear war. And Johnson also has to be thinking, if Alan Dulles and these guys and James Angleton and even Pyre are behind this, I don't want to take these guys on. That's what he's thinking. I'm not going down that road. And certainly Hoover and Johnson also hated the Kennedys. So they're not taking on the CIA anyway, but they're definitely not taking them on to defend the Kennedys. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So any questions before we wrap it up, buddy?
No more questions, Sean. I think this was really great. It was a great episode. It's not something that you see a lot about or hear a lot about or read a lot about. It's something you did a lot of research on personally. And
I did, but Bill, you know what? Let's give a lot of credit to the people like James D'Eugenio, Lisa Peace, Jim Douglas is another one. These people researched this for years, for 25, 30 years. They dedicated a lot of their life to looking through these documents and writing books. And these people deserve so much credit, for bringing the truth out. Even if the mainstream media wants to look the other way on it, these people are tremendous researchers and tremendous authors. And, they should be, looked at as American heroes in my book.
I agree with you. And clearly, I think the media, mainstream media doesn't really, and I'm not somebody who criticizes the mainstream media a lot. It's a business. They do what they need to do. They're there to make money and get advertising, make money and ratings. And that's, that's a business. And we all know that. I'm not somebody who criticizes the mainstream media. But they don't want to cover this anymore.
No.
They feel like, the American public isn't going to pay attention. There's not enough interest in it to get ratings. And I think just by, just going by our first episode and some of the feedback we've gotten, there is still a lot of interest.
There's a tremendous interest, Bill.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if they let out the truth, then they got to answer the question, well, why are you just saying this now? And why did you say something totally different 50, 60 years ago? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well,
All right, buddy.
great episode, Sean. The listener's going to have and I know we have at least one listener because she sent in a question to us. Hopefully we have more. I know we have more because I've been looking at the numbers, some pretty good numbers out there, a lot of downloads. If you have questions for Sean about this episode or about any of our shows, send us an email. That's enough out of you at Gmail, or I'm sorry, that's enough out of you show at gmail.com. And you can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. Find us on YouTube. Go to our YouTube channel, subscribe. Let us know. Give us your feedback and your questions. We'll answer them right here on the show, just like we did today.
All right, buddy. I'm going to go for that jog, pal.
All right, Sean, you go for a jog, and we'll talk to you later. And that's enough out of you.
Good night, everybody.